How many amateur fights should you have before you go pro? If you're a fighter right now and you think you're ready, type "I'm ready" in the comments. So we have this little community. It's called Fighters Heaven online, and if you want to be a part of it, you click down below. Now, one of the members, Manny Hampusin, sorry if I'm butchering your name. He's like 20 years old, and he asked me this question in the community. He said he has got 12 amateur fights. That's a lot of amateur fights. 12 amateur fights, some won, some lost, and he wants another 6 before he goes pro. So he's like, what do you think about that? Here's my philosophy on fighting amateur and going pro. Amateur is where you practice things until you learn the lessons you need to try to ensure that you have a very clean record as a pro. Nobody cares about your amateur record. There's no UFC, Bellator, PFL, GFL that cares and is going to even look at what you did as an amateur. They only look at what you've done once you've turned professional. So I don't really care if I lose as an amateur. Obviously, you don't really want to lose, like losing can hurt, but you can risk that a little bit more in the amateurs. Your main goal is to get experience dealing with all of the problems you're gonna have to solve once you're pro. Can you beat a wrestler? Can you beat a striker? Can you beat a jiu-jitsu guy? Can you beat a well-rounded MMA fighter that is like a jack of all trades, but not really fantastic at any one thing specifically? Can you beat a power punching juggernaut? A lot of power punching juggernauts right before you get into the UFC, and right as you get into the UFC, you're gonna see a lot of less skilled but tough, durable fighters. You need to be able to solve these problems. And it's best to learn those lessons when nobody is counting your losses. There's a few things to think about. That's one. You want experience. Another thing that you want to think about is your age. So Manny is 20 years old. That's quite young, which is good because the UFC wants you at 27. So you need to be ready. You need to be ready to go into contenders, to go into the Ultimate Fighter at around 26, 27. So you need to make sure that you're scheduling your fights appropriately. I think it's a good thing to fight a lot as an amateur, to fight quite frequently. Now that doesn't mean you necessarily need 25 fights as an amateur, but they should happen quite rapidly because you can grow so much from fighting. You can grow vastly more from fighting than you could just from training. So in the case of Mr. Manny, now I looked up your record, Manny, and on Tapology, which obviously isn't correct because it doesn't have all your fights there, said that you're 3-3. So I'm not sure what your actual record is, but your last 3 fights were losses. If you were 3-3 and your last 3 fights were wins, I would say you should probably go pro now. You've already got 12 fights, you're 20 years old, go pro now, right? You're gonna be able to slow play your pro career a little bit and be a little choosier with your opponents because you still have 7 years before you need to be UFC ready. Okay, so then you can pick your fights a little bit. But because your last 3 fights were losses, that doesn't mean you suck, that doesn't mean you're not good, it just means that you have some things to learn still. So I would take a look at those losses and see what is common with them. Are you getting taken down and unable to get back up? Are you getting hit too much? Do you have a hole in boxing, wrestling, Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu? How well-rounded are you? Okay, and then I would look at those faults and go and spend some time fixing them and then go and test them again. So I would be trying to find opponents that are very similar to the opponents that you've lost to. Maybe a lower caliber, but a similar test, a similar style, right? So if you're losing to wrestlers, get the anti-wrestler guide, and then book a fight against a wrestler again. See if you solve the problem. If you can solve that problem, perfect. Are there any other problems? Oh, there's no other problems that we're really seeing, so it's time to go pro. All right, so first thing we need to do is we need to make sure we're getting experience and learning the lessons from the defeats, okay? And then we want to have some positive momentum as well when we're going in, so it's best to go in off of a win in your last fight than off of a loss. And then the last thing is your age. You don't want to wait until you're too old, right? You don't want to wait until you're 35 before you're ready to go to the UFC, if you can help it. So Coaches, this is why I say start your fighters early. The earlier, the better. You should start training your fighters in their childhood, right? Earlier, the better. Infancy, earlier, the better. Once you've taken these 3 things into account, it's time to make the jump. Are you ready? Do you think you're ready? So Manny said that it was his idea to have another 6 fights, bringing his total amateur fight record to like 18 fights before he goes pro. And then he wants to go pro somewhere around 2026. Now, I'm not saying that that's a totally bad plan, but I think you could go pro faster than that, right? I don't think you would need another 6 fights, maybe another 3. If you spend all of your career in the amateurs, you're just going to be older by the time you are ready to go into the UFC. And if you are ready to go into the UFC at 24 instead of 27, that is a huge advantage. If Dana White and Sean Shelby are looking at 2 different people, and one person is 28 and they have an 8-0 record, and the other person is 24 and they have a 7-1 record, they'll probably pick the guy that's 24 with a 7-1 record, as long as they're finishing. Maybe that's another thing we should talk about. You need to finish your fights. So one of the lessons that you should be working on in the amateurs is the ability to finish, either by knockout, TKO, or submission. It doesn't really matter how you finish, as long as you finish. But it can really help if it's exciting. If you just fake a poopy kick, shoot a single leg that's really nice, drag the guy to the ground, take his back, and spend 5 minutes on his back just struggling to choke him, and then eventually choke him at the end of the round, or you do that for 3 rounds and then choke him at the end of the 3rd round. You gotta finish, but it was really not that exciting until that finish. So you need to finish, you need to be exciting. These are things that you need to try to address while you're an amateur, because there's less pressure, right? Do it while there's less pressure, when nobody's counting your losses, and then when it really matters, it'll be a whole lot easier than trying to do something when it matters, when you've never even done it before. Very difficult. So we need to learn our lessons. We need to make sure that we spend as little time in the amateurs as possible while still enabling us to learn those lessons. So don't slow play it, speed it up, get a lot of fights as quick as possible. We need to make sure that in the lessons we're learning, we can fight a grappler, we can fight a striker, we can fight a power puncher, we can fight a generalist MMA fighter, we can fight all the different types of specialists. And we've removed as many of the holes in our game as possible before going pro. Again, start young, it's much easier. We need to make sure that we're getting finishes, and we need to make sure that we're exciting. Once you can cross all those T's and dot all those I's, now it's time to go pro and make some money. We could talk about how to conduct your pro career, but that's another video. Big shout outs to Manny. I appreciate the question, man. I hope you hear this answer. And if you guys want your questions answered, get to Fighters Heaven. Peace.